Hello and welcome to episode 448 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back. How you doing?
Well, it's good to be back, and it's our anniversary, so it's a big birthday. It's our 14th birthday. So Money to the Masses was 14 last Sunday. Every year, like most people do, as you get older, you start to forget your birthday, and we actually share the same birthday as Facebook. So whenever Facebook has a birthday, you know that Money to Masses is having a birthday too. We were 14 last Sunday, so that was a milestone for us. And for those who don't know the story, I'll give you the quick version of what Money to Masses or how it came about. And it was something that I created 14 years ago it was a blog. My daughter was just been born. I come back from paternity leave, deciding what to do with myself when I was working in the city, and essentially started giving away my knowledge for free on the internet, and it started to gain traction. After about 4 years, I then started working on it full time, quit my day job, and then here we are 14 years later. Money to the Masses towers. Andy, you work on the site. The rest of the team are working on the site as well. So we are a real family, but it's been 14 years, and yeah, it's every year it's still going. I still have a buzz for doing it.
And it was good that you clarified that it's the Money to the Masses anniversary, because as you started that piece, I did think that we'd celebrated some sort of milestone together, you and I, Damien.
Well, we did last year. We were 20 years that we've known each other.
That's true.
So since we've been working, 21 years. I don't know what that is this year. On that note of the anniversary and birthday, it was amazing to receive an email, which I'm going to read out from a listener, and actually somebody who does 80/20 Investor. And it is hard work doing what we do. We do a lot of stuff that's for free, this podcast, for example, and it's a lot of work that goes into it. And over the years, that it is nice to get the feedback and realise that we are having an impact on people out there, and we are making a difference. Because you have to realise, despite the fact that if you're watching the YouTube channel, you can see us doing this podcast, or you listen to the show every week, it is a one-way thing often. So we get feedback every now and then, and when you leave reviews, they do have a massive impact on us in terms of motivation. I'm just going to read this email out quickly. I'm not going to name the person, but they will know who they are when they hear this particular message. So the email said, "Hi Damien, I'd first like to thank you very much for the mug you sent ages ago to me. It is used regularly, not my favourite mug, but it's up there. That's slightly disappointing, but we'll gloss over that. But on a serious note, this morning I've started to sell the entirety of my shares and fund account to pay off my mortgage. From the advice you have given me through your portfolio, I've increased its value by around £12,000. And then the message goes on, but it finishes off to say that they are paying off their mortgage. So they're very happy that at age 36, that by the end of this month, they will be mortgage free. I cannot thank you enough for the advice and help that I get through your podcast and portfolio. And I do highly recommend you to others, but people think they always know best. Have a great day and enjoy your Sunday. You are greatly appreciated and change my life for the better." Now, that is an amazing email and feedback to get, because, as I say, it is really uplifting. So when I got that, it was quite funny, really, because I was on Sunday morning, the podcast had just gone out, and I suddenly realised it was our birthday and should have mentioned it last week. So I got that email last week when the podcast had just gone out, and I realised it was our birthday. And that message, I don't think they would realise what a lift it gave me to receive something, to think, yeah, I've really made a difference, even to one person. And so all of these emails and reviews that you give us do have a big impact. I shared it with the team first thing on Monday, and it gave everybody a lift. So do please review the podcast. Whatever app you use, 5 stars is always appreciated, but it does have a material impact. You've got to realise that whatever you do in life, if there is something that happens, that somebody does a great bit of service or whatever it may be, do give that feedback. And that's why I've always done it. I've always realised if somebody does something that I do think they've gone the extra mile, I always like to give the feedback, whether it's maybe I did once do it for a doctor who inadvertently realised that I had E. coli and had an infection after an operation and made me go to hospital, and I didn't want to go, and then luckily it turned out okay. But again, I fed back because they've done something that had really helped me. So do give that feedback if you get a chance. So now moving on, before we tell you what's on the show this week, one thing I did want to point out, last week we talked about the car mis-selling, and there's been a great tool that's been created by Martin Lewis. We'll put a link in the notes of the show so you can go through to it, and it actually just creates a template for you to be able to start the ball rolling on finding out whether you had possibly been mis-sold, or find out information whether you've been mis-sold car finance in the past. So I'll put a link to it. Go and use it if you're interested. Again, the details of what we spoke about last week are still true. And so we don't know there's going to be a widespread compensation event later in the year. We're still waiting to see what the FCA decides.
Great. And then, so what have we got coming up on this week's show? 3 pieces as usual, I suspect.
Yeah, so the 3 pieces, an investment piece. Now, I'm going to be doing a piece about managed ISAs. We're entering ISA season, and a lot of people, maybe if they're new investors, might be wanting to get involved in investing in a stocks and shares ISA to benefit from that tax relief. Or they may be an experienced investor and they do their own investing. They're DIY, they pick their own funds. I'm going to be talking about the performance of some managed ISAs out there from what so-called robo-advisors. But even if you don't want somebody to run the money for you, the information I'm going to give you is going to give you a good benchmark about performance levels over the last 5 years, which you can then apply to your own self-run investment. So if you run your own portfolio, it'll be incredibly useful. And Andy, you're going to be doing the other 2 pieces, in fact.
Yeah, so the first piece I'm going to cover is in regards to health insurance, specifically cancer and health insurance, because we've had increased interest this week. There's been stuff happening in the news, which I'm sure listeners will be aware of. And it's led to a few people to contact us and ask about health insurance and whether cancer is covered on that. So I'll be covering a piece that looks at health insurance, specifically cancer, and how the top insurers handle it. And the final piece of the podcast, we're going to be talking about cashback again. I love cashback. I've been really getting involved with it. And I'm just going to give you my experience of something that happened to me quite recently where I managed to stack cashback rewards and how people at home can do that quite easily.
Yeah, and it was impressive. That was why it's become a podcast piece. I badgered Andy to do it on the podcast because what he managed to achieve in terms of cashback, I was very impressed with. So we're going to kick straight on with the investment piece, Andy, before I sit back and then fall silent while you do the rest of the show. Okay, so there'll be plenty of people out there who may be looking to take out an ISA before the tax year ends, but there are going to be lots of people who are interested in a managed ISA. Now, I call it a managed ISA, but it's really a service where a robo-advice proposition, so we're talking about the likes of Nutmeg, maybe Money Farm, Wealthify, where you can go and pick a portfolio. They will then run the money for you. And so you don't have to worry about the underlying investments, whether you're investing in equities, bonds, or whether you're investing in American equities, all those sorts of things, they do it for you. And so the one key message really with investing is it's important about getting started and actually the contribution. So actually paying money in. The management part, you can now get that done by somebody else online cost effectively. So the wonderful thing about the world of money now compared to say, even when we started this show nearly 10 years ago, the wealth of products, the range of services out there is very different. There is an amazing array of services out there, whether it's budgeting apps to investing. I mean, the ability now that you can actually go and buy something in the shops and the spare change is invested for you is quite amazing. So there are lots of things out there. It's never been a better time to run your own money or invest it. So assuming that you want to go out there and invest, but you don't know where to start, some of these propositions are obviously a good first port of call. So what we did, or actually Andy did a lot of the analysis, crunched the numbers on the performance of some of the key robo-advisors out there. So Wealthify, Nutmeg, Money Farm. We also looked at the Vanguard Life Strategy Fund because it's a very popular one that people refer to. And so we looked at the different portfolios these providers have, and we went for the sort of mid-range, so something that was pretty moderate risk, and we looked either side of that as well. So the way we worked that out is looking at the equity content of portfolios. So as a tip, if you don't know the sort of range of or the amount of risk that portfolio is taking, have a look at the equity content. So if you're looking at something that's only got, say, 20% equity in it, then that's relatively low risk because the other assets are most likely, if you check, invest in things like bonds. But we're looking at something that's investing around about 50 to 70% in equity. So there's a range there. A mid-balanced portfolio will probably have around about 60% equities and 40% bonds or alternative assets. And once you start getting above that, heading towards 70 and then 80%, that's when you're getting into the much higher risk end of the spectrum. So we looked at the range of portfolios around that mid-level. We looked at the portfolio's equity content to be able to compare apples with apples. The issue is if you look at the performance figures just of all the different portfolios that the providers issue, it's hard to compare like with like because some providers have 10 portfolios, some people only have maybe 5 or 7. So what you need to do is, if this is a tip generally, if you're trying to pick any ready-made portfolio off the shelf, whether it's one of these robo-advice propositions or something like Vanguard, look at the equity content, because you want to make sure that you're comparing two portfolios that have a similar equity content. Because over the long term, something that has a higher equity content should outperform one that's got a lower equity content. We're talking about over the long term, because you're taking more investment risk. Over different time periods, in the shorter time period, the one with large equity content could obviously underperform the one with a lower equity content because stock markets crash. So what you want to do is make sure you're comparing like with like. So we did that, and we produced a table. We're going to put a link to the full article about the best performing stocks and shares ISAs in the market. We're going to put a link to that in the show notes so people can go and have a look at it and go through the analysis themselves and take their time, because I'm not going to go through all the numbers on the podcast. It'd be pretty dull and it would be quite hard to follow. But after looking at the equity content on all the different portfolios, we picked our list. We then sort of bunched them together in ones that were comparable. But what we also did, we are at the stage now where these propositions have been around for more than 5 years. So one of the issues when we go back, say 5 or 6 years, they're all new and you didn't know whether they're any good. Now you can get some decent length in terms of past performance. So we now have the figures that we've crunched for the last 5 years. We've looked at each individual calendar year, but we then looked at the annualized performance over that 5-year period. So when I say annualized performance, what I mean is what would the total return you got over the 5 years, what did that equate to on average that you got each year? And so you can compare those. But what's important is not just looking at a destination, so what somebody made over a period of time, is to look at the performance in different calendar years as well. So the reason I say that is because 2022 was a terrible year for investing. It was one of the worst on record. So bond markets crashed, equity markets crashed. And one of the big things in investing is to try and limit the drawdowns that you have, because then you limit the downside, because you have to remember that if you lose 50% of the value of your portfolio, that portfolio has to gain 100% just to get back to where you were. And so you want to limit that downside. So it's important to look at how well a portfolio does in the bullish years like 2021, and actually 2023 was pretty good too, but also how they did on the downside. So when we had a bad year, how much did they fall? And that gives you a hint about how you manage risk. Now, I have talked about on the podcast previously about different metrics like alpha and beta and Sharpe ratios, when you can look at those to give a very statistical analysis of how a manager performs and manages risks and actually makes the most of the risks they're taking. But unfortunately, you won't find those for these portfolios. They're not published. So the best thing to do is look at how these portfolios fared in different years compared to each other. But rather than go through all the details, I'm going to give you some highlights. And for individuals out there who are listening and they run their own money, what I want to do is give you some benchmarks. So, for example, last year, if you looked at the typical portfolio across these different providers that I've mentioned, and you looked at one that had an average of about 60% equity exposure, then in 2023, they made roughly 10%. The average was 10.17%. And so you could look at your portfolio, and if you had a similar makeup of equity content, then you can say, were you in line with that? Now, if you had about 70% equity content, so a little bit more risk, then they made about 11.5%. But then here lies the issue just looking at the last year. If you look at 2022, both of those different equity exposures, so the 60% and the 70%, they finished down just over 13%. So they were down at that point. That wouldn't have been their low. That was even after some sort of recovery, they were down 13% that year. Now that shows you that if you just looked at 2023, then you might sit and think, oh, my portfolio maybe only made 5%, 6%. But if you only fell 4% in 2022, you'd be sitting on a profit across those 2 years. And interestingly, when I went across a range of portfolios for the different providers and looked at these mid-range ones, there was only actually one of the portfolios that we looked at that across 2022 and 2023 as an entirety, that 2-year span, there was only one that made a profit. So they might have made lots of money in 2023, but they dipped to a larger extent in 2022, but they hadn't recovered those losses. So that is something interesting. If you are an investor, if you are sitting on a profit across basically the last 2 years, and especially those 2 calendar years, you've done well. And it isn't all about what you did in 2023. So that's why we look at the annualized returns. If you're looking at the 5-year annualized returns for a mid-range portfolio, if you're on about 5.5% annualized returns, you're making 5.5% on average a year over the last 5 years, then you are broadly in line with these professionally run portfolios. That's if you've got a 60% equity exposure. But if you've got a 70% equity exposure, you're probably looking at about 6.8% is the average. So there's some benchmarks there for everybody. So you can look at portfolios. If you're somebody who's going to look at a managed portfolio, use those as a benchmark. If you're someone running your own money, you can say, well, how have I done? And you can use, again, these as a benchmark. Are you beating the services that are out there for the people who want to have somebody manage the money for them? So you're beating the professionals. Are you doing that? So it is also interesting, if you look at the data, the most we saw was about an annualized return of 7%. That was from a Wealthify portfolio, actually, an SRI portfolio. This is one of the ethical portfolios. So that's something that people might want to look at. And again, there was other ethical portfolios that seem to manage risk quite well. Money Farm have one in there. So I'm not going to go through them all. It's not a promo. You can look at the data. We'll put a link in the show notes. But what it does do is it gives you a benchmark. It gives you some analysis to look at when picking a provider. And overall, one message I would say is that it's most important of all that you invest, that you get started, because the range of returns are fairly tight if you look at the numbers. There aren't any complete disasters. So there isn't anybody out there who say, let's say the average, as I mentioned, was about 5.5 to 6%. There was nobody who did 1%. There was no one who did 2 or even had negative numbers. So they run things in a very similar way with similar equity contents and alternative assets. So they're all probably using very similar ETFs. So there'll be ETFs that track maybe the US stock market. So the way they're constructed gives you some element of confidence. So the main thing is you go out there and pick one and start using them. And of course you can change providers as well going forward. And I also happen to this week be looking at my own portfolio that I run on 80/20 Investor. And it was interesting to see that I've just hit its own milestone. It hit a new all-time high in terms of profit. And the 50k portfolio that I've been running for nearly 9 years now is now actually, I shouldn't call it the 50k portfolio anymore. I should call it the £80,000 portfolio, because it's now worth just over £81,000. So it's got a 62% profit. So, I mean, I'm incredibly pleased with that. But on that portfolio, if you want to take out a free trial of 80/20 Investor, you can see the data. But I was able to analyze all those different metrics I mentioned, Sharpe ratios and Sortino ratios, and I could look at see how that portfolio would have performed if it had been in the typical multi-asset sector. So that's the mixed 40 to 85% share sector, the unit trust funds. That's where you'll find most multi-asset funds, like the Vanguard Life Strategy 60% fund and the 80% equity fund actually is in that same sector. And not only was the return good of my portfolio, and I'm very pleased with it, but the metrics for the risk management were also among the best. So across every one of those metrics, it was in the top quartile, and in some instances, there are very few portfolios that beat it in terms of risk management. So I'm pleased. The journey is as important as the destination, is what I'm trying to say, because obviously you can just take incredible amounts of risk and hopefully over the long term you'll be rewarded, but it's about the volatility, the ups and downs in between. And of course my portfolio did very well in 2022 on a comparative basis. I don't think it lost more than 5% at its worst point compared to some of the numbers I said earlier. So it was nice to get that message I mentioned in a nice circular reference to the review I had earlier on, to see that it made a difference to people, because I do put a lot of effort into it. So there you go, a nice piece for the ISA season as we head towards that deadline. So if you're interested, the link in the notes of the podcast and the YouTube video where you can go and look at the performance data. But it isn't just about performance. It's also about the services these propositions offer, cost. The numbers I talk about actually take into account all the fees. So do bear in mind costs, do bear in mind the customer service, for example, and not all of these propositions will offer the products you might want, like junior ISAs, like lifetime ISAs. They might not allow you to be able to invest in other things, which again, if you want to invest in other things, then you have to move away from managed ISAs, but it gives you plenty of food for thought.
And if you are considering investing in an ISA for the first time, there are offers available for taking out ISAs as well. So what I'll do is I'll pop in the show notes a link to an article where we've pulled together all the best cashback, fee-free, all of these kind of offers, and we'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, it's great. We should always mention that, because we pulled together that analysis, and there is also that analysis for pensions, isn't there? So we've done it for pensions. So there's lots of cashback offers. It's very unusual because in the past there were never many cashback offers in the the industry, but now they've become the norm. So if you are taking out a stocks and shares ISA, or you are taking out a pension maybe this year, then do look, there's plenty of decent cashback offers. Most of the pension ones are related to transfers. So you might have an existing fund, but some of them are paying very generous amounts, up to £1,000. So it's worth having a look if you are considering consolidating or moving your pensions.
Great stuff. So let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. And we're going to be talking about health insurance and cancer. Now, it's one of those topics that we don't like to talk about, but we all know someone, sadly, who has been going through a cancer diagnosis and treatment. And so there are products out there that you can use that will help with things like diagnostics and treatment. And we have had a few questions from our listeners saying, look, health insurance, is it worth it? What sort of cancer cover is there and how does it work? So just briefly, we have covered things like critical illness cover in the past, which does do a payout for cancers. We're not covering that in this part of the podcast. We'll link to articles and shows that we've done in the past that talk about critical illness cover, which is a lump sum payout. And we'll link to that in the show notes. This is something slightly different.
Yeah, so when we're talking about critical illness, just for those who may not have heard those shows before, but critical illness cover will pay out upon diagnosis of certain conditions that are covered by the policy. So it's not that we're talking about. This is now about health insurance.
Exactly right. So we looked at the top health insurance providers throughout the UK market. So we're talking about companies such as AXA, Aviva, Bupa and Vitality. And we looked at the benefits that you can get on their different types of policies, and we pulled that information together. Now, it's important to note that while all health insurance providers will cover cancer in some form, not all of them cover it as standard as part of their core cover. So for some insurers, you'll have to add it on as an additional benefit and there'll be an additional cost for that. But similarly, some companies will add it on as what they call a core benefit, but then you can strip it back and you can simplify the cover and bring down the cost. And there are two ways you can do that. You can remove cancer cover completely, which of course means you won't be covered for cancer, or you can actually take out something which is like an NHS benefit. And we'll talk about NHS and how the NHS dovetails in with health insurance in just a second. So what I'll do is I'll quickly go through the top insurers and explain their cancer cover and just read out a brief bit of the wording. So Aviva is one of the top insurers and cancer is covered as part of their core health insurance. And Aviva has a cancer pledge stating that they'll cover the cancer treatment, palliative care as recommended by the specialist. It also provides aftercare, including consultations. So with Aviva, they have what's called a 6-week NHS option, which is the ability to reduce the premiums if treatment is available on the NHS within 6 weeks. If it's not, then they will fast track you through to treatment. So it's like an insurance policy on the insurance policy. So they'll cover you, but the NHS is the first port of call.
So it's almost like an insurance policy on the NHS that they might fail you and not actually deliver what we are expecting. And we've got to be realistic. I mean, unfortunately, the NHS isn't able to deliver often the standards of care that people are hoping for. And so this is really something that is, like you said, gives it some fallback that it will pay out if the NHS can't deliver in a set period of time.
And if getting treated quickly is high on your priority list, but you don't want to pay through the nose, you could take the NHS 6-week option. And then within 6 weeks, you're going to get looked at, you're going to get diagnosed, you're going to get the treatment process started. Another thing that Aviva offer, and a lot of insurers offer this as well, is what they call a cash payment if you get treated by the NHS. So let's ignore the 6-week options. Let's assume with Aviva you've taken the full cancer cover, but for whatever reason, whether it's because you were already under the NHS care and you get fast tracked through and you're happy with the NHS service you're receiving, because you've had the insurance in place and you didn't take advantage of it, they'll pay a cash payment for every night or every day that you're having to receive treatment. And with Aviva, that's £100 for each day or night of eligible treatment with no limits on there. So some do have limits, some don't. So on Aviva, it's no limits. Some additional benefits with the Aviva cover is things such as 5 video GP sessions each year. You'll find most insurers offer GP either by phone or by video call. Some do allow you to see an actual GP, but there may be an additional cost. Aviva limit it to 5 a year, but it's still pretty good. And there's additional benefits where you can get discounts off health clubs and things like that. So that's Aviva. I'm going to go through 2 or 3 others. So AXA also provide cancer as part of their core cover, and they'll provide a dedicated case manager throughout the treatment process. You'll get access to the latest licensed proven drugs that aren't even available yet on the NHS, which is quite interesting. They They also have an NHS cancer support option, which is slightly different to the 6-week option we talked about earlier. This one is good for those who simply just want to cut down on the cost because it is cheaper, or for those who don't actually qualify for the cancer cover. Let's say, for example, they've got close family members who have suffered cancer recently, or if they've had a history of cancer themselves, they could take the NHS cancer support option. And what it does is it doesn't cover for treatment. However, it will cover the cost of licensed cancer drugs, which the NHS won't pay for. So it's kind of like this middle ground. You're guaranteeing potential treatment if the NHS is saying it can't do it. In terms of additional benefits on the AXA cover, again, they give you what's called Doctor at Hand, which is access to a virtual GP or advanced nurse practitioner. And they also do additional support for things like muscle pain, bone and joint pain. And they also have a specialist menopause support service, which is available for free.
I mean, I don't know if I should say this. I always try and be very independent. I don't talk about the products and services that I tend to use, but I mean, I have to say, I've used AXA health insurance, and anyone listening to the podcast will know that not long ago I had an operation on my hand that was causing problems, and it was actually done via them, and the experience was good. I mean, you are having to pay for these things. So, I mean, obviously mine was just a general issue, nothing related to obviously cancer or anything, but we have a lot of people interested in health insurance at the moment, and it is something that is being largely driven by families, in fact. So it's changing the dynamic of that market where people are wanting cover for their entire families, and part of that is particularly they want it for their children, and some of these services also have obviously benefits for mental health as well. So that's an aside. I've diverted, Andy, but I know there'll be people sitting there listening to this and thinking about health insurance, and we're talking about cancer in particular, but at the claims process, you don't have to think that people are trying to get out of paying for things, because my own experience when it comes to claims, it hasn't worked like that at all. But everybody is different.
And funny, you mentioned there about families. Bupa, who I'm just coming on to now, they're really coming into their own this year. They've really moved their product on. And one of the key benefits of taking out a Bupa policy, if you want to involve your children within your policy, is they'll only charge for one child, irrespective of how many children you add to the policy. So it becomes quite cost effective.
So it becomes like those holiday packages where the second child goes free.
Exactly that. So Bupa, in terms of cancer cover, they automatically add it as part of their core service, but you can remove the full cancer cover from the policy. So it's kind of added in at the start, and you have a price, but then you can opt to take that out. So if you want to save on costs, you can do that, but obviously you won't be covered for any cancer related issues. Their full cancer cover ensures that you have access to any cancer drug in the UK that's licensed for the condition, even if it's not NICE approved. NICE stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. It's the kind of the standard in the health industry. So you will potentially get access to additional drugs within the Bupa policy. It says it will support members from diagnosis to treatment, and also for palliative care if needed. It states that everyone's cover is individual, and you may have some limits or exclusions on your policy. So it's important that there is some caveats in there, but speak to an expert. If you've got any particular concerns, we'll put details in the notes of the best people to speak to. You can ask them the questions and they will tell you quite clearly whether Bupa is going to be right for you or not. Bupa also has an NHS Cancer Cover Plus option, which will provide cover only if, in the first instance, the NHS cannot provide the treatment. So there isn't a date attached to that, but if the NHS is unable to treat you, then you revert to Bupa in that instance. And if you do get treated within the NHS and you do have the cancer cover included, again, you can get that cash payment if you do decide to get treated, or you do end up getting treated through the NHS. And that cash payment is £100 per day. In terms of additional benefits with Bupa, you get access to a members area where you can get discounts off of online gym memberships, and also access to discounted dental treatment if that interests you. I'll move on to the final one now, because these are the four main top health insurers that you would have heard of. We'll move on to Vitality. Now, Vitality's cancer cover is extremely good. All plans include advanced cancer cover, which pays for all costs associated with any cancer diagnosis. Effectively, it means if you are diagnosed with cancer, Vitality will cover your inpatient and outpatient operation costs in full. They will also pay up to £300 for any wigs or restyling of your hair, which is quite interesting. The others don't do restyling. They'll pay up to £200 also for any mastectomy bras if needed, and up to £5,000 for any prosthesis that's required. Again, they do have this cash payment if you end up getting treated through the NHS. That's £125 per day or £250 if you are treated as an inpatient. And in terms of rewards, we've talked about Vitality before. They're probably the market leader. They've got an excellent range of rewards. Go and check out our Vitality review. We'll put links in the show notes. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the fact that cancer is covered on most health insurance products. You will end up paying for it in most instances.
Yeah, and of course, the surge of interest in this was obviously led by the news story, obviously, regarding King Charles as well this week. So that was why there's lots about people interested in searching about cancer and what would happen if they got it and what could they do about it and things like that. What I want people also to do is we're going to put a link in the notes to an interview that we did with Emma Thompson, who's a friend of ours, like somebody we used to work with, but also worked in the industry. And unfortunately, she was diagnosed at a young age with breast cancer. And she talked about the impact that had on her, but also the benefit of the policies that she had, insurance policies, and one of them being health insurance. And some of the points that you're mentioning at the end there on that last policy about things that would be things you didn't even think about, things like wigs and things like that. There are benefits of health insurance that you won't think about until you're actually in that moment. And I remember Emma talking about one of the things of being able to have some money from one of her policies. It was actually a critical illness policy, I think, that paid out for her. That enabled her to be able to pay someone to help wash her hair. And it's those things that you don't think about how your life will be impacted. The message is there are insurances out there that can be tailored to your budget, and it's something that we're probably all going to have to face at some point within our families. The other thing to mention is that you may have heard all this and think, well, I'd like to have a conversation with someone about what are the possibilities. Now, we can put a link in the notes of the podcast to a specialist who you can talk to. So someone we trust is actually somebody that I've personally used, a service that looks at all of the market and will review the policies each year for you as well and tailor the solutions to you and your budget and your family. So it's worth having a conversation. We'll put a link in the notes. It does help support the podcast as well. It doesn't make any difference to what you pay ultimately, but it does help keep the Money to Messes podcast free as well. But the main message is have the conversations with your family. There are policies out there that can cover things that can be tailored as well. It don't have to be expensive. So it's something to bear in mind. I think it's an excellent piece, Andy. So that then moves us on to our final piece of the podcast, which is in relation to cashback.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about cashback. Now, we covered cashback a few weeks ago in the podcast, just before Christmas, actually. We mentioned one of the cashback apps in particular. In fact, we mentioned two. They were Jam Donut, and also Hyperjar was another one that introduced some new cashback vouchers. Now, cashback vouchers and gift cards are becoming a very popular thing. Essentially what they do is they enable you to buy vouchers in advance of you then using those vouchers almost as cash. So I'll give you a scenario. You're walking down the high street, you pop into one of your high street favourites, let's say, I don't know, it's Primark. You know you need to go in there and you need to spend £60 on, I don't know, a coat and a nice top. Before you then go in and pay on your debit card or credit card in the usual way, you simply go into the app, you buy vouchers within the app, and then you use that voucher in store. It can be that quick. In the space of 2 minutes, you could have downloaded the voucher, paid for it. But crucially, by doing that, through the app, you would have earned a percentage of cash back. I think at the moment, Primark, something like 8%. It's decent. So you earn the money in the app straight away as immediate cash back. That cash back can then be spent straight away on other vouchers, or you can withdraw it as cash once you've gone over the, I think you have to get about £10 before you can start withdrawing the cash out.
And before you carry on, Andy, as you mentioned, I think that we've done a review on it on the podcast and we talked about it a few months ago. We'll put a link in the notes of the podcast just so people can go through and listen to it in a bit more detail how it works.
Yeah. And I've been doing this since we did the podcast back in November, and I built up a significant amount of cash back within the app itself. And so last week I was in the market for a new major appliance. I've upgraded my washing machine rather begrudgingly to a washer dryer. I never thought it would happen. I've always been told these are bad things because there's two things in one appliance, so it's going to go wrong. I know it's going to go wrong, but hey, here we are. I'm buying a washer dryer. So I knew I was going to have to spend at least £500 on this thing. So I started to research, and then I remembered I've got my vouchers and I've got my cashback app. What can I do to maximize my cashback? So I went into this mindset of not just earning some cashback through Jam Donut, which I'm used to doing anyway. Is there another way? Can I use my experience through the work that I do, but also my frugalness to try and stack up as many of these cashback offers as I could? And I managed to do it. I actually managed in the end to get 5 different styles of cashback in different forms stacked up onto this one purchase. So I'll quickly go through it. So the total purchase price was about £550 once you included delivery and services like installation and things like that. So immediately what I did is, when typing into the browser, immediately Honey, which is a Chrome extension, kicked into action when I started to go into the checkout area. And Honey is, if you don't know, just briefly, it's a Chrome extension. You can also just use it as a normal website which you log into, and you can manually search for codes. But as the Chrome extension, it will automatically search for you for voucher codes throughout the whole of the internet, and it will test them in the checkout while you're there. And it will say, we found a voucher code and it works, and this is the one. And it will automatically then apply that discount voucher off of your purchase and show it.
It is incredible that it does it. Like you say, you're just shopping. It could be any shop, and suddenly it'll pop up and say, it'll give you a voucher code to give you a discount. If you use Chrome, if you don't download Chrome browser, start using it. As I'm sitting here, actually, I'm on my laptop while we're doing this podcast. If you go up to the settings, the 3 dots in the top right-hand corner of the browser, and you go down to extensions, you will see there's something there that then pops up, manage extensions or visit Chrome Web Store. If you go into that and then you type in Honey, once you go to the visit Chrome Web Store option, you can then download it. It's free, and then it will start to work in the background.
So I managed to get £15 discount immediately without even trying, which I was quite happy with. Honey also does something called Honey Gold, which is when you make a purchase, if you're logged in to Honey, you will then get points. Now, points add up to vouchers and prizes. So I was able to get £4 worth of Honey Gold, which is essentially credit. And then once you earn enough Honey Gold, you can then exchange that for vouchers. So another £4 again through Honey. So that's 2 different ones. I then went into my cashback app of choice, which is Jam Donut, and selected the retailer who was on there and made a purchase of, I think it was about £250 worth of vouchers. Actually, a tip on that: don't load a lot of money onto vouchers and then suddenly you find, oh, this purchase, you're not allowed to apply a gift card or a voucher to it. So I did a test first. I did test it first of all with a £10 voucher to make sure it works. So I got £13.75 back on cashback through the vouchers. I then got a referral bonus, which is a different type of cashback, of £4 from Jam Donut itself, because I was clever enough to split the vouchers, half me and half my wife. So my wife has also got the Jam Donut app. So if you've got a friend who wants to take out the Jam Donut cashback app, you can refer them. There's a referral code in there.
So you referred your wife to get the app?
I referred my wife to get the app. She then bought the vouchers for this purchase. And so we got a £4 referral bonus. That's number 4. And then the remainder of the purchase, I did decide to put on a credit card. There's various reasons why I did that, mainly because of consumer protection, the section 75. We'll link to that in the show notes. That enabled me to get cashback through my Amex cashback card, and I got about £4.50 cashback on there. So overall, I got something in the region of £42 cashback through 5 different routes. I was quite pleased.
That is impressive, Andy. And Andy came in and told me that, and I was marvelling at the stacking nature of his cashback. Jordan Cox, who's been on our show and a friend of mine to the masses, will be in awe of what you managed to achieve. We will put a link actually to all the things that Andy talked about in the podcast, all those different apps, etc., so you can go and have a look at them. But what was also good about that, there wasn't a top cashback in sight in what you did, because I remember I had top cashback and used it once upon a time, and well, the retailer rejected my cashback, and there was no reason why it did. When I appealed, never got the money back, and I kind of fell out of love before it even started with the idea of cashback. But I have personally started to use credit cards to get cash back. Now, I've always been somebody who's been a little bit averse to using credit cards for cash back, because I do think there is an incentive that's in there for people to use credit cards to gain cash back. And there is almost an element, not gamification, it's probably the wrong word, but something where you start looking at, oh, how much cash back am I making? And really, I think I'm at the point now where I obviously are fully in charge of my finances. I clear my credit card at the end of every month so I don't accrue any debt. And after doing that for a number of years, it just became ridiculous, the fact that I wasn't actually using it for cashback. So my message is, if you're going to use a cashback credit card and you're very disciplined, fabulous. But I think I needed to, obviously, after proving to myself for many years that I'm fully capable of having cleared debt, not accruing anymore, and our lifestyles were working like that, then it just became ridiculous that I wasn't actually using the cashback credit cards. I'll put a link actually in the notes again. It's going to be quite a lot of links this week to the review of the best cashback credit cards out there. To be honest with you, it's a choice between a couple of Amex cards, to be quite truthful. So I have, Andy, you'll be pleased to know, started to get onto the cashback wagon, but I'm not quite in your league. So I've got some work to do, but hopefully I will one day be able to tell you a story of how I managed to achieve something very similar to you.
I would absolutely love that. Just the final thing on gift cards and cashback vouchers is, if you end up needing to take that product back or send it back or refund it for whatever reason, often the refund policy will be you'll be given vouchers in return. So do make sure that if you're making a purchase, you could end up with hundreds of pounds worth of vouchers on a faulty product. And if you've fallen out of love with that retailer, it will make it quite difficult for you to try and spend that amount of money with them again.
Yeah.
It's just a word of warning.
Yeah. So there are obviously drawbacks to all of these things. Like Andy mentioned, you've got to be mindful of the expiry of the codes themselves, so the vouchers themselves. And obviously the other thing is, if you're accruing cashback, you have got to be reliant on the fact that the app is going to be in existence in the future. So make sure you withdraw your cashback and don't just leave it piling up. So Andy, that is it for this week. As ever, if you enjoyed the show, please do leave a review. I mean, I begged almost at the beginning of the show. Please leave a review, 5 stars, please, via any app of choice that you use to listen to the show. We'll be trying to give away some mugs. I'm feeling quite generous given it's our 14th birthday. For those of you out there who are waiting mugs, or awaiting mugs, I should say, I will be honest, I've still got them on my desk. I've got to get to the point where I've sent them away to people because I've got to visit the post office. So they are going to be with you at some point in the not too distant future, I hope. Do follow us on socials.
One point of order I've just remembered before we finish for this week. We're going to have a break next week. It's half term. We're going to spend some time with our families. We don't normally have a break this early on in the year, but it does mean that we'll be fresh and raring to go when we come back from that.
We don't normally have a break this early in the year, although we did have one, the week before when I wasn't very well. So we've already broken that. This will be the second time. But as I say, we'll be raring to go. In fact, I think next week I'm going to be spending time with the family, but also decorating, which is slightly disappointing. But as I say, follow us on the socials, usual ones, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the Facebook group is facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And obviously we're on Threads as well, though I'm trying to do a bit more on social media this year. I think we're trying to do a bit more than we have been in the past, because it'd be quite nice to do something a little bit different. I think I'm going to find myself with a little bit more time to do it, particularly YouTube. So do follow us on YouTube. There's a lot of content on YouTube that doesn't make it to the podcast. So for example, this week I've looked at the best business bank accounts, done videos on that, latest interest rates. So there's all this sort of stuff that appears on our YouTube channel that won't appear on the podcast because it may be a little bit topical. So do bear that in mind. And like, we do review a lot of products on there as well.
And make sure if you've got a comment or question about this week's show or ideas about future shows, and do make sure you comment on those YouTube videos that are going out and the YouTube podcast channel as well, because that's a great way for us to be able to have a conversation almost and respond to your questions.
So that is it, Andy.
That's it. We are done. Until next time.
Until next time.